to our session on socialism and feminism. I'm Brian Donnelly. I teach way out in Oakville at Sheridan College. The session is sponsored by the Education Committee of the Greater Toronto Workers' Assembly. I'm happy to have you all here. Thanks for coming out. We've got two speakers tonight. Abbie Bakan will speak first. She's from the University of Toronto. The title of her speech, Marxism, Feminism, and Indigeneity, Rethinking and Rereading Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. I hope you got all that. And Sue Ferguson is from Wilfrid Laurier, speaking on social reproduction theory. So, I could give, well, this is part of a series. There's been a session already. There's another session coming up on December 14th on Luxembourg, Lennon, and Levy. I'll re-announce that after the talks. I'll let Abbie begin.
Okay, thank you. Do I need this?
Yes.
Is this better? Okay. So, yeah, thank you, Brian, and thank you, Roy, and thank you all for coming to talk to us. Sue Ferguson and I have found ourselves at a couple of international conferences together, so we thought it might be nice to actually speak in the city we live in. On questions of socialism and feminism. We both just come back from the Historical Materialism Conference in London, and before that, in the summer, we were at the Socialism Conference in Chicago in July, speaking on related topics. So what I would like to talk to you about today is a classic text called The Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. It was published by Friedrich Engels the year after Karl Marx, his lifelong collaborator, died. So Karl Marx died in 1883 with most of his writings unfinished and unpublished. And Friedrich Engels then turned his attention to writing the unfinished works, and the very first one that he attended to was called The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. The subtitle of the book tells the story of what it actually is about, quote, in light of the researches of Lewis H. Morgan. So Morgan published a major study of the life and social organization of the Iroquois, or who we would call the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous nations, 5 and then 6, which had survived the violence of colonial occupation and resided in the area of northern New York State for a period of time following the United States Civil War. The study, Morgan's book, was published in 1877, and it was titled Ancient Society, or Researchers in the Lines of Human Progress Through Savagery, Barbarism to Civilization. It was and remains a foundational text, and there has been a lot of attention devoted to its pages. According to Morgan's biographer, Morgan created the science of anthropology, and it has become commonplace to consider Morgan to be the founding father of the discipline of anthropology. So importantly, among the contributions that Morgan provided, some positive, some negative, there was a detailed account of an indigenous population where women were not subjected to patriarchal oppression. This observation has been confirmed repeatedly, not least through the continued practices, oral histories, and contributions to scholarship and policy of indigenous peoples themselves, and particularly indigenous women. Even the findings of a curious place to be talking in a meeting on socialist feminism, a Canadian government commission, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, the report that was published in 1996. Even this report identified specifically that the colonial project, including the residential school, sorry, get water. Sorry. Edit that out, Pachi. Including the residential schools, were designed particularly to remove children from their families, in part because of the values that were being carried from generation to generation about gender equality. That was one of the reasons that the residential schools were considered necessary. So Morgan's study, in coming to the view that women and men could live in relations of gender equality, sharply challenged the patriarchal assumptions of Victorian morality that were current in the lifetimes of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. So this work attracted their attention. Marx's embrace of Morgan's work, as well as Engels' enthusiasm, is indicated in a letter that Friedrich Engels wrote to his erstwhile collaborator, the German socialist leader Karl Kautsky, in February of 1884. What he wrote, in his words, "On the original states of society, there is a definitive book, a book as definitive as Darwin's for biology. It has, of course, been discovered by Marx." Morgan, Ancient Society, 1877. Those are Engels' words. So The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State was published in the same year as this letter was written, 1884, and it was based on Marx's detailed notebooks on Morgan's work. So we've got Engels writing on Marx, and Marx writing on Morgan, and Morgan writing on the Iroquois, and that's the pattern of this text. So notably, Engels makes a very strong case for women's emancipation, thoroughly grounded in the historical materialist method that he advanced with Marx, but also enthusiastically reliant on Morgan's Ancient Society. So, Morgan's work has taken the place of sort of being seen as a foundation of this classic, Engels' Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State. It's been pivotal in Marxist and feminist theorizations of the family, in terms of the origins of women's oppression, in terms of the nature and history of ruling class hegemony, and in terms of state and property relations. So certainly Morgan's Ancient Society was original in some ways. It suggested a scientific basis of a relationship between indigenous and non-indigenous peoples, thus earning it the capacity of being a founder of modern anthropology. But he also made another assertion that there was a direct lineage in social development from what were termed savagery, barbarism, and civilization. And this was actually not original at all. It was a reflection of a very typical Eurocentric view among American white settlers. It was common in Scottish Enlightenment theories. It was a standard textbook issue in 19th century US colleges. And in fact, Morgan's deep curiosity about the surviving subjects of European colonization was not innocent. He was a political philosopher that was part of the American ruling class project. He was not considered a radical in any way. He was not marginalized in any way. And what he was presenting was a view that was consistent with a vision of a world that was consistent with capitalism and colonialism, not a world that was free of oppression as socialists and feminists today would imagine. So, scant attention among Marxist writers has been devoted to the experiences of the indigenous women that were the objects of the original study. And that's what I want to spend a little bit of time talking about here. So, there is another way to look at the origin of the origins. And this is in terms of the contribution of critical race, post-colonial, and indigenous feminist writers who informed the reading that I'm suggesting here and the discussion that I would like to share with you here. So contrary to Engels' notion, which is in The Origins of the Family, Private Property, and the State, that the defeat of the historic equality of women and men represents, in his words, the world historic defeat of the female sex, it was actually the strong women of the Haudenosaunee, or what are referred to as the Gantuisas, who taught Lewis Henry Morgan that another world might be possible than the colonial one that he had seen, which included these patriarchal relations between men and women. The keepers of those stories remain present and active today. They have carried on that tradition through oral histories and through shared experiences. Indigenous women writers and activists continue to tell their stories, and the communities that were the objects of Morgan's investigation could continue to arguably be seen as the subjects of resistance to present-day colonialization, which is not only a US story, it's very much a Canadian story. I owe a good portion of what I've learned in this reading of The Origin of the Origins to Janice Hill, who is the director of the First Nations Aboriginal Student Center at Queen's University, who was a clan mother at Tyendinaga, and whose stories are exactly the same stories of the strong women who were originally talking to Lewis Morgan many years ago. So, to proceed, what's the way to look at this? It's obviously that this is a big story, and I just want to make 3 points. One is that Morgan didn't make this up. He was guided by an indigenous leader named Ely Parker, who has tended to be written out of the way we understand the history of the classics in the Marxist tradition. The second point is that it wasn't only Marx and Engels who got inspired by the concept of gender equality. It was also first wave American feminism that owed a great deal to the experiences of the indigenous women of the Haudenosaunee. And third, I just want to conclude by thinking a little bit about how do we read classic texts in the Marxist tradition? How do we read old books? in contemporary society in a way that is actually inspiring social change and putting it in some type of a context. So, okay, so Henry Louis Morgan and Ely Parker. Louis Morgan lived 1818 to 1881. Who was this guy and why did he get interested in these people? He was a colonial settler. He lived in upstate New York in the years surrounding the American Civil War. He was well integrated into American elite society. He was a member of the National Academy of Sciences. He served as the president of the American Association of the Advancement of Science. And from such a background, it's pretty curious that he would become interested in the indigenous societies of upstate New York, who had managed to survive until that period of colonialism. So the truth is that Morgan was assisted by someone that, of indigenous feminist author, I have her book here, Barbara Alice Mann refers to as his unacknowledged co-author, of another book. This was a study that preceded the publication of the 1877 Ancient Society by 26 years, titled The League of the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois. And this was Ely S. Parker, who lived 1828 to 1895. He was a member of the Seneca, which was one of the nations of the Iroquois Confederacy. Parker attended a missionary school and he learned to speak English fluently, so he was fluent in both Seneca and English. And he ultimately became quite successful in both societies. He was an attorney, an engineer, he was a Grand Sachem or leader of the Six Nations. He also served as an advisor to Ulysses S. Grant. Parker worked very closely with Morgan literally over decades, translating historic teachings and conversations, guiding him to attend Indigenous community events, devoting many, many, many hours to tutoring in a very, sort of different view of the quote-unquote savagery that was the standard notion of colonial society at the time. According to Barbara Mann, this is a quote, although Morgan dedicated, quote-unquote, his work to Parker and briefly acknowledged that it had been to Parker's, quote-unquote, friendly services and invaluable assistance during the whole progress of the research, close quote, that the study had been written at all, I have only ever seen Parker's great-nephew, Arthur C. Parker, highlight his contributions as a matter of importance. For the most part, assuming they know Ely Parker at all, modern Euro-American scholars typically ignore Morgan's deep debt to him. So socialist feminism clearly owes a great deal to indigenous societies. So does first wave feminism. Feminist theory and history is very complex and there's no simple linear model, but there is this way that we talk about it. It's subject to tremendous critique, which is that it's gone through these various waves, and each wave seems radical at the time, but looking back at it historically, it doesn't look that radical, sort of read in hindsight. So first wave feminism was fighting for women to be people and have the vote. Second wave feminism was for women to have some type of bodily integrity, some control over their bodies, and recognition and equality. Third wave feminism is commonly seen as the contemporary sort of continuation of this around issues of color, gender, queer relations, transgender relations, and so on. But the first wave of feminists who advanced women's rights in the United States were also students of the Haudenosaunee nations. Needless to say, this history has also been varied. There are a variety of ways of approaching this, but Sally Roche Wagner, who's a feminist who's discovered this, has written a book called Sisters in Spirit, Haudenosaunee Iroquois Influence on American Early Feminists, where she documents that while first wave feminism is commonly associated with the suffrage leader, Susan B. Anthony, actually Susan B. Anthony was part of a sort of triumvirate of women, all of whom worked in and around with the Seneca, and people might remember the notion of the Seneca Falls Conference. So that was actually on the same territory that Morgan was studying. So in addition to Susan B. Anthony, there was also Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and there was Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Gage and Stanton, who have not been as well known in the history of first wave feminism, worked in collaboration with Anthony, but they tended to have a bit of a division of labor among themselves, and in addition to the vote, the things that were in their sort of target zone was the Christian church, religion in general, the state, capital, and a whole series of other types of relations of patriarchal society. These were not socialist advocates, they were radical Democrats. But they actively studied with and beside Six Nations as an inspiration to challenge the absolutely misogynist characteristics of US colonial life. According to Wagner, one of the features about American society, because remember this is the former colonies, and then they rebel and they have a civil war and they're trying to form their own nation and so on, and they were very anti-British about many things, except, according to Wagner, the European tradition of church and law placed women in the role of property. Then the men looked to England for their model. So they challenged a whole lot of things about the British, but they took with them and carried with them the notion of Victorian morality. So the legacy of these early feminists is very mixed. Their main project was certainly compromised by their class position. Instead of seeking a new world full of equality, they sought equality with men in a white racist context. But for socialist feminists today, I think there's a different way to read this story, which is that the resistance and the voice of indigenous feminism continues to serve as an inspiration for a variety of forms of feminism, including liberal feminism and socialist feminism. And obviously the strand that we're interested in is the one that fights for a better world without racism, free of sexism and colonial oppression. So finally, let me turn to this question of how we read socialist history from that context. So the origin of origins is about an origin story, obviously. And origin stories are significant in lots of ways. There's a political philosopher, Joanne Wright, who has written a book called Origin Stories, and she specifically identifies that there is sort of this, in all political philosophy, there's this kind of urge to find out where things started, not least in feminism. So this is certainly the case if you're living in an oppressive society which has colonization and racism as part of its claimed origin story, there's a tendency to erase the indigenous roots that predate settler colonialism. And the contributions of indigenous women's experiences, their own voices, their own stories, have been buried, have been marginalized, have been silenced by colonial settlement and racism. And it seems to me that it would be important for us as socialists to actually recognize that we're not immune from that type of silencing. And arguably, a different way of reading Engels can allow us to sort of reverse the gaze. Reading Engels' origins in the 21st century, for those of you who have tried to do this, it doesn't make for light entertainment. It's arguably not Engels' best work. In his own words, a meager substitute for what my departed friend no longer had the time to do. There's a lot of critiques. There are a lot of feminist critiques. There are critiques in modern anthropology. There's certainly Marxist critiques about the origins. Probably one of the most interesting is author Heather Brown has recently written a book about Engels and Marx and feminism, and she particularly emphasizes the distinctions between Engels and Marx's work in terms of some of these relations with indigenous societies and literature around that. But Morgan's overt racism is something that I think we need to come to terms with and recognize that there's no evidence that either Marx or Engels actually were critics of this. Now, Ancient Society's on the web. It's easy to read at this point and to access, but Morgan's overt racism is pretty profound. It's most extreme towards Africa and those of African descent. And this isn't what Ancient Society is about. This is written in some of his other texts. But I'll just give you a quote. This is actually, anyway, it's pretty shocking. But this one is actually from Ancient Society. In Africa, we encounter a chaos of savagery and barbarism. Original arts and inventions have largely disappeared. Africa, in the main, is a barren ethnological field. Although the home of the Negro race, it is well known that their numbers are limited and their areas are small. Now, in a previous work called Systems of Consanguinity and Affinity of the Human Family, that's published as the 17th volume of the Smithsonian Contributions to Knowledge in 1871, here's how Morgan puts it. The people of pure Negro stock are known to be limited in numbers on the African continent, unimportant, feeble in intellect, inferior in rank to in every portion of the human family, Yet they center themselves in their unknown past and mysterious presence as one of the greatest problems in the science of families of mankind. So what he goes on to say, I mean, this is disgusting stuff. What he goes on to say is basically, he says, the biggest problem for us in figuring out how we're human is figuring out how we could possibly relate it to these African people. So where does this fit in terms of Morgan's notion of indigenous society? Well, there's one interesting reading by someone named Yael Ben-Zvi, who maintains that what Morgan was doing was trying to claim that there's a colonial project that sees indigenous people as essentially the predecessors of white Aryan society, as opposed to the black population, which had recently been freed in the Civil War. It's an old strategy of divide and conquer. So this is consistent with Morgan's work in the Origins of Family, Private Property, and the State, which he concludes by saying the following: the Aryan family represents the central stream of human progress because it produced the highest type of mankind and because it has proved its intrinsic superiority by gradually assuming the control of the earth. So his argument about barbarism, savagery, and civilization, and his argument about some type of a connection between early societies and later societies is actually an assimilation story. It's a story about saying indigenous people have to be seen as white, not black, and we have to move away from a conception of colonial settlement as being one of multiple races, the red, white, and the black. It's going to be strictly between the white and the black. The white are the civilized, and the black, which he writes about in his other texts and in a minor way in Ancient Society, are uninteresting to us because they haven't been able to quote-unquote evolve. This is bad stuff. Okay. So recognizing this colonial imprint in Morgan's research and Engels and Marx's failure to unpack it are important features in noting the ambiguous legacy of the origins. This is not to say that there isn't something important in Engels' Origin of the Family, Private Property, and the State. And then it's not to say that there isn't something important in identifying, I'm coming to a close here, okay.
That wasn't significant.
Oh, okay. That there isn't something significant in reading and seeing the question about the contribution about gender equality as its relationship to private property, inheritance, accumulation, and so on. But it is important, I think, to recognize that the strong women of the Haudenosaunee, who were the original teachers of the whole idea of socialist feminism in the Marxist tradition, can still be our teachers today. And that's not the way we normally think about the legacy of the classical Marxists. I mean, I have, I guess, a pretty classical Marxist education, such as one can get it. And the argument is that it goes from, from Babel to Engels and Marx, and then to, you get a debate about whether you go with Trotsky or Stalin or not, and then you sort of try to pick it up in terms of the contemporary debates that happened in the 60s and 70s, and you read Poulentz's and Althusser and so on and so forth. But it's largely about great men, and then once in a while you bring in Rosa Luxemburg and you remember Clara Zetkin, but it's largely a sort of notion of reading these texts written by Europeans. It's not about actually looking at the colonial settlement and the legacy of that colonial settlement and recognizing that right here in Ontario and in upstate New York, those who can educate the educator are actually still among us.